So, we've encountered the word a few times before, policies. I mentioned that they can be applied at many levels, at the level of the product, at the level of the API, at the level of a single operation defined inside of an API, but we haven't created one yet. Let's open our Travel Inspiration API, and I'm going to open the app service one as an example. Let me make the screen a little bit bigger here. There we go. If we look at the URI here, we see that it ends with API/destinations. I'm not completely happy with that. As mentioned before, by default, the URI fragment that's applied to the front end is applied to the backend service as well. But I don't really want that /API part in the URI here. We are exposing APIs from APIM. There is no need to add API inside of the URI as well. Yet, if I remove that, save, and test this, I get back a 404 resource not found. And that is because the same URI fragment is used when sending the requests downstreams to the backend. And there the /API fragment is necessary. With a policy, we can fix this. So let's go back to the Design tab. Let's open the Search Destinations operation. And let's open the policies here for inbound processing. Via this screen, we can add policies to the inbound, outbound, backend, and on-error parts of our API definition in APIM. In other words, we can configure and manipulate the request and response in various places during a regular request-response cycle. Let me expand this screen here. There's a bunch of policies here that cover almost everything. Via Show Snippets, I can find them. And what you find here are policies related to authentication, policies related to transformation like masking URIs, policies to convert between JSON and XML, and more. You can effectively fully rewrite whatever is incoming and even call into external services before continuing down the line, for example by using a send request policy. What we are interested in is the rewrite URI policy. So let's click that, and there we go. To learn how to use a policy, there's an extensive list of all available policies and how to use them available over at the API Management Policy reference on Microsoft's documentation site. You can find all of them here, and you can click through to them to find the details, including examples of how to use it. I'm not going to run through all of them, that would take up about half a day, but like this you know where to find them, including the documentation. Let's have a look at the rewrite URI one. There's two attributes we can set, parameters we can fill out. The template, i.e. the actual downstream web service URI with any query string parameters. And then there's a parameter, copy unmatched params. This specifies whether query parameters in the incoming request, not present in the original URI template, are added to the URI defined by the rewrite template. It is true by default. We could now simply go ahead and fully hardcode the downstream URL template. But I want to show you how we can use a policy expression to at least partially avoid that. As the last fragment, destinations, of the incoming URL matches the last fragment of the downstream URL. Policy expressions are pieces of code evaluated at runtime. Through them, we can implement behavior just like we would in a programming language. In fact, a subset of .NET's types are supported, so this is actually a form of inline C# code. Just like there's a lot of policies, there's also a lot of policy expressions. You can find an overview of them via the link on screen in Microsoft's documentation. As you can see here from the examples, this actually is C# code. With add, you can add a single or multi-line expression. For example, to execute mathematics to get the string length, execute a regular expression, or even conditional behavior as you see in the part I have selected right now. When working with policy expressions, the object you'll most likely interact the most with is the context. Through that, you can get access to the full request and response, including the headers, the body, and so on. This tends to come in handy when creating policies. Anyway, let's switch back to our portal and let's fill out our rewrite policy. So the first thing I want to do is extract a part of the incoming URL, the destinations part. That's the one that I want. I'm going to store that in a variable. I don't want to hard code it. For that, I can use set variable. I'm going to give it a name, last path segment, let's say. And I'm also going to give it a value. I'm going to use a policy expression for that. So I want to access the context on it. I want to access a request, the URL, the path, and then I want to split that on / and only store the last part. And then I need to set the template of the rewrite URI policy. What we want to do here is get the last path segment variable and append that to / API. So, as template, I'm going to return / API / plus the last path segment variable. We can access that via the variables dictionary on the context. So I pass through last path segment here. All right. Let's save this. And let's test this. I'm testing it from the portal, so there's no need to manually pass through a subscription key. That happens automatically behind the scenes. Let's click send. And there we go. We got back a successful response. So with that, our first policy was written. We specifically wrote this for one operation now, for search destinations, but in case you want to apply it to all operations, simply click all operations here and add the policy at that level. Or even one level up, at level of a product, you will also find a policy tab where you can add this policy. Alright, so far for our first taste of policies. There's another use case we can use this for. Securing downstream access to our function. Let's have a look. We have a problem. Our call to the function app endpoints doesn't work because it requires a valid token with a valid audience created by a valid client. As a refresher, let's open that endpoint and let's say we're going to send a request to get itineraries. We can use the test tab for that, so let me send that. And what we get back is this 401 unauthorized because we didn't pass through a valid means of authentication, a valid token. When we created a Logic App workflow that also integrates with that same function downstream, we use the managed identity for that. We can do something likewise here. The first thing to do is enable APIM's managed identity. So let's go back. And let's look for the identity tab. Let's open the managed identities blade. Let's set system assigned managed identity to on and let's save it. This will enable a system assigned managed identity for APIM. There we go. Let's note down this object or principal ID. We will need it. Then we need to change something at level of the function app. We need to ensure that tokens generated by our managed identity, so by APIM's managed identity, are allowed. We still remember how to do that. Let's go to our function app and let's navigate to the authentication blade. As you remember, this is where we configured authentication for the function app. Let's edit the identity provider settings below here. Let me scroll down a bit. As you remember, we are pretty strict here. Both the identity and the client app identifier must be inputted. So, as an allowed identity, I can already input the principal ID of APIM system assigned managed identity we just noted down. Let's save that. All right. That's one thing done. The second thing we need to find is the application or client identifier. As you remember, when a system-assigned managed identity is created, a registration with the same name as the resource the managed identity belongs to is added to Entra ID. And it's that identifier we need. So let me open Entra ID. And let's look for the name we gave our APIM instance. And we indeed find this one, Enterprise Application here. Let's click it. And let's note down the application ID. That's the one we're going to need. Once we've got that, we can go back to our function, back to the authentication blade, back to the identity provider settings down here. We open the allowed client applications list and we add the application ID of APIM's app registration over on Entra ID to this list. Now let's save. Alright, with that our function app is correctly configured. There's just one thing left to do now. We need to ensure that our APIM's managed identity is now used to get a token when we need to access the downstream function. We can do that with a policy. So let's open our APIM instance again. Let's click APIs here and let's open the function API. This time I'm going to open the policies for all operations at the same time because we want this to be applied to all operations we defined through that function app. So let me open the inbound processing tab here and let's make this a bit bigger. There we go. The policy we are looking for is the authentication managed identity policy. Seeing we are using a system-assigned managed identity and there is only one per resource, it will automatically be inferred seeing we are on this APIM instance. So we don't need to pass through that identifier. We do need to pass through the resource we need to access. In other words, the thing we want to end up in the audience value list. And we already know what that is. HTTPS management.azure.com, as that is the one that we check for. Let me get rid of my typo here. Otherwise, it's obviously not going to work. So what this line of code, this policy will do is generate a token using APIM's system-assigned managed identity, and it will automatically set it as bearer token value for the authorization header for downstream access to the function app endpoints. Let's save this and let's give it a try. I'm going to get the itineraries. Let's go to the test tab here and let's send a request. Now let's have a look. And there we go. We get back a 200 OK with our itineraries in the response body. In other words, we again have access in a secure manner to the downstream function app endpoint. Again, if this doesn't immediately work, give it a minute or two so your changes have time to be propagated. Anyway, this is downstream access. But what about incoming requests? Let's have a look at that next.